everyone. My name is Albert Świdziński. I'm the Director of Analysis at Strategy&Future. It is May 1st, 2020. And with me today is Mr. David P. Goldman. David was an advisor to the Reagan administration in the 1980s. He is a columnist at the Asia Times. He used to publish under the pseudonym Spengler. David advised Pentagon. He's an author of multiple books, including It's Not the End of the World, It's Just the End of You, and How Civilizations Die and Why Islam is Dying Too. David is also a classical music critic, which is quite a spread in interests, if I may say. And I think David has a book coming up in July. At least that's what I've heard in one of the podcasts. So thank you for accepting the invitation, David.
Oh, my privilege. Thanks so much for inviting me.
David, so I wanted to start with a basic observation, because I would like to focus on the US-China rivalry, which seems to be ever accelerating these days. And I think the contours, the logical chain of events that led these two countries on a path to certain collision was visible already in early 2010s. With the election of Donald J. Trump back in 2016, over the course of his presidency, the domains of this clash, the initial domains of this clash became obvious, and that is trade and technology. And now in May, with the COVID-19 being the great catalyst, it seems that it has taken a turn for the worse in a very, very rapid progression. We now hear multiple statements that are rather inflammatory. And I wanted to ask you, David, where do you think this is going with this catalyst that COVID-19 was, with the clash, with the statements of the Trump administration, with the statements coming from Beijing in the recent days? Where do you think that is headed?
Well, remember, the United States has had a shock economically and socially, such as we have not had since the Civil War. The effect of World War II and World War I on the home life of Americans was, in a certain way, less than what we've experienced in the last several weeks. So Americans are trying to understand what happened to them, and they're certainly anxious to blame someone. And it's certainly the case that China, in many respects, behaved quite badly in its reporting and discussion of COVID-19. I think that there's been a somewhat exaggerated attempt to lay all of the blame at China's door for this. And it makes good politics. It looks like Trump is going to run not against Joe Biden, but against Xi Jinping for president. He's been talking about holding China accountable. His chief economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, today said we're going to hold China accountable. What that means practically, though, is quite unclear. And at this point, I don't know whether we're talking about a war of words or a real revival of the trade war that we seem to have put behind us in January, or an intensification of the technology war, which the United States has conducted, particularly with reference to Huawei during the last couple of years. Whatever happens, I think US-China relations will deteriorate. And the interesting question for me, and particularly for a European audience, is what does this mean for the rest of the world? If the United States attempts to decouple from China, and Europe and a good deal of Asia does not decouple from China, does that mean the United States begins to isolate itself? That's a very difficult question about which we can only guess at the
moment. David, looking at this, because it seems evident that return to status quo ante is impossible. Things won't be as they were. China will not accept its position within the value chains that it once occupied, that once permitted it to gain stature, but now it's grown out of this. The US doesn't appear at this point in time be willing to accept this. It recognizes the challenge. So there is a couple possible scenarios. There is possible power sharing agreement of sorts in the Pacific. There is possibility of this situation evolving to simplify, to greatly oversimplify, because the situation is very different. But Cold War, of course, Soviet Russia was never a part of global economy, so that makes it far more messy. and looking at the recent statements which you compared to which stated meet the definition of a warlike action, of seizure of Chinese assets or lifting sovereign
Immunity.
immunity. Thank you. This looks this begins to look like it could evolve in something even worse than Cold War 2.0.
Well, there's a big difference between the United States-China relationship now and the United States-Russia relationship. Economic relations between the United States and Russia were at an extremely low level throughout. The entire American tech industry has grown in symbiosis with China. 5 years ago, there was a popular phrase, Chimerica, because American companies concentrated on software and depended on Asia for the hardware. So our largest imports from China, as of 2019, maybe 120, $130 billion a year is consumer hardware, consumer electronics, about $70 billion in smartphones, $40 billion in computers, and so forth. This has been a great boom for the American tech industry. The American tech industry discovered years ago that software is more profitable than hardware because the cost of adding an additional customer is zero, and the network effects are spectacular. So the trillion-dollar companies we have are software companies, Microsoft, Amazon, and so forth. And for the Asians, this was a natural fit because not just the Chinese, but also Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and so forth, subsidized capital-intensive industry. We in the United States subsidize football stadiums, they subsidize chip fabrication plants and steel mills. Our imports from China alone are equal to 1/4 of total industrial production. So when you talk about decoupling from China, if you wanted to do that, we'd have to replace $500 billion a year in industrial production. That's not easy to do. The expense of that would be staggering. We certainly don't have the labor to do it. There are lots of skills which we'd have to train up from scratch. So it would be a multi-year effort. In my view, it's very misguided to try to replace existing industries with existing technology at vast expense. We should be engaged in a strategic rivalry with China, and an aggressive one, but it should be focused on new technologies, not existing technologies, dominating the key industries of the next 10 to 20 years, not the previous 10 to 20 years.
So, but this again, it sort of involves, it accepts that certain battles have been lost, and and winning them at this point is impossible. It would appear like the 5G, for example.
Well, that's right, but 5G is a much bigger issue. There's the mobile broadband itself, and then there are the spin-off applications, which range from everything to driverless cars, to artificial intelligence, to the control of drone swarms for military purposes, to manufacturing based on communication among robots and so forth. What worries me is not so much 5G itself, but China's view, their plan for years has been to use 5G mobile broadband as a springboard for dominating critical technologies, of which the most interesting right now is medical artificial intelligence. So Huawei has a plan, and they talk about it quite openly at their conferences, nothing secret, to get 1 billion people onto their network in the next 10 years. Tencent and Alibaba are doing similar things. Now, imagine if you had digitized patient records, medical histories, for 1 billion people. You have their DNA sequenced, and you give them smartphone attachments, which every day measure their blood oxygen level, body temperature, blood pressure, even an EKG, electrocardiogram. And you feed that into a massive cloud database. At that point, the raw material for artificial intelligence in diagnostics, pharmaceutical development, epidemic control, and other applications would be staggering. And medicine is going to be the biggest industry of the 21st century. It's already the biggest industry in the United States, 18% of gross domestic product. And if China dominates that, if it dominates medical artificial intelligence, it will dominate AI in all fields. So they have a head start, but they haven't consolidated that position. In my view, the West, the United States, in cooperation, ideally with NATO partners, should be aiming at dominating the industries which spin off from AI.
But this still appears to be a huge challenge, and you often bring up the statistics as to how many high school graduates go to study in STEM in China and in the US. And in the US, it's about 6 to 7%. In China, it's 33. And I remember one of your quotes, which really stayed with me, is to the question, will China overtake the US? You answered basically yes, unless we do something about it. And this something is what you propose, a massive spending plan of PPP sort of, right? This is the moonshot, the late 1970s and 80s under Reagan administration. How would that look like?
Well, you're absolutely right to draw attention to our educational. Right now, the smartest American kids go into software because that's where the money is. We graduate only 43,000 mechanical engineers per year, which is about half the German level. It's pretty pathetic. And the mechanical engineering schools tend not to get the smartest kids. They're all looking to be hired by Google and Microsoft. Before that, it was Wall Street that hired the best engineers. They did financial engineering. So we certainly need to repair that. My view is that there are plenty of Chinese who don't like the regime, who'd love to be in the United States. We should be aggressively recruiting foreign talent because we're going to need them. Even to teach American kids, we'll need to recruit foreign engineering professors. 80% of our doctoral candidates in electrical engineering are foreign, of whom the Chinese are the largest group. There's an objection that Chinese who come here might spy for Beijing. Well, no doubt you'll get some spies, and no doubt counterintelligence will be a challenge. But the most important thing is to secure the talent pool. I think that public-private partnerships are the key, as you indicated. If we simply subsidize industries, then we get a bunch of politicians choosing the winners, and that always leads to corruption. During the 1970s and 1980s, when America created the digital economy from scratch, we had a very simple approach. The Defense Department spent vast amounts of money on basic research. It gave them to corporate laboratories like Bell Labs, GE Labs, RCA Labs, many of which sadly no longer exist. And the basic research then was commercialized at the risk of private entrepreneurs. So the bright line is between subsidizing basic research with long-term implications, and on the other hand, letting private entrepreneurs take the risk of commercialization. One interesting, I'll give you two facts about that. In the 70s and 80s, every single invention of the digital age, without exception, came from a Defense Department subsidy. Graphic user interface, the internet itself, CMOS manufacturing of computer chips, flat panel displays, semiconductor lasers, and optical networks, no exceptions. Second fact, none of these inventions was used for the purpose that the Defense Department originally had in mind. The semiconductor laser, which gave us optical networks, was developed at RCA Labs because someone at Pentagon wanted to fight battles at night and illuminate the battlefield at night. And what they discovered had implications 1,000,000 times more important than the original idea. So it's very important to push basic research in a way that allows us to find out about the unknown unknowns. You can't specify your targets too carefully. You have to create a density of basic research with the hope that the inventions you create exceed your expectations. That was true with NASA. It was true with the defense buildup of the 70s and 80s. I think we can do it again.
This is also, I think, what President Trump suggested with this. Well, he suggested starting out this project of revamping infrastructure. I would imagine he meant transport infrastructure, the $2 trillion one, but also it could easily be extended to high tech. But my question is, this is a massive plan. This is you compared it to Manhattan Project, for example, or the 70s and 80s. And that was guided by the risk of being overtaken by Russia. And we wrote a lot about Ogarkov and his plans, his designs. But the point is, if you want to have Manhattan Project, you have to start with Manhattan Project for primary schools, for education, to bring up this entire generation of engineers that were directed and guided and educated in the right way.
Well, you're absolutely correct. After Sputnik, President Eisenhower passed the National Defense Education Act, which offered scholarships for science and engineering and also certain other related national security fields of education. It was enormously successful. If you can believe it, back in the late 1950s and early 60s, girls thought engineers were sexy.
It's the right way to think about stuff, It's not basketball players.
Right. So, yes, we would need to do that. Culturally, we have a challenge. The levels of American education have deteriorated. We'd have to emphasize accomplishment rather than diversity. We've spent much too much time worrying about equality and not enough time worried about excellence. Not that we shouldn't try to be inclusive and try to raise everybody up, but I would really like to see federal money going to engineering as opposed to gender studies.
And he compared this also to China, which is, as you call it, a ruthless meritocracy, which really only promotes the brightest and makes sure to sieve them out from the general population. And this also brings me back to this. What happens because what you propose is a U-turn, really. It's a stunning program, very, very ambitious, necessary, but very ambitious. What happens if the US is unable to materialize what you recommend in any shape or form? What happens then?
Well, then we look like the British Empire in the 1940s and 1950s. We become a second-rate power. China becomes the dominant power in the world. The world will be a nastier and a more dangerous place, and the United States will be poorer and less secure and less happy. It won't be the end of the world. I don't believe that China wants to rule all of us and turn us all into kidney donors. The Chinese have always been indifferent as to how we barbarians govern ourselves. They simply want us to all pay tribute to the empire. They want to be the center of the world. A Chinese-dominated world would not be an optimal world to live in by any means. And as we've seen, the Chinese are capable of unspeakable cruelty on a great scale. This is a culture which has many magnificent accomplishments, but one of them is not respecting the sanctity of individual life, which in my view is the hallmark, the cornerstone of Western civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization. So I would not like that to happen, but that's what would happen if the United States fails.
And another, do you view this, seeing those most recent statements? I know we're running out of time, but seeing those most recent statements, do you think, how feasible is kinetic confrontation in the South China Sea? Do you think that's valid? Do you think this can get out of hand, miscalculated?
Well, the problem with kinetic confrontation is China has spent a vast amount of money to control its coasts. It has a lot of surface-to-ship missiles, a lot of diesel-electric submarines, and other things which give it the ability to defend its coast. So if we wanted to send a military force against China, we'd have great difficulty doing so. And we know that China, not because of its navy, but more because of its missiles, dominates the South China coast. There was a report last year from the University of Sydney in Australia arguing that China, in a matter of hours, could destroy the vast majority of American assets in that part of the Pacific with its missiles. So my view is we've already lost the South China Sea. China has, by massive investment, made itself secure in its borders. So the only way a kinetic event would be caused was by real stupid miscalculation. I don't think it's like World War I. We don't have armies standing at each other's borders. If one mobilizes, the other has to mobilize. You know, if the Red Army in 1941 is sitting in a bulge pointing towards Germany and the Wehrmacht is another bulge pointed towards Russia, one of them is going to move first. It's not like that. So I think shooting war between the United States and China is fortunately a very unlikely outcome in the foreseeable future.
David, a while ago, I listened to a conversation between Professor Mearsheimer and Australia's Hugh White. And what was stunning is that while Professor White being from Australia, he tried to avoid a situation where Australia would be forced to choose, because it's clearly American-made security and China-made prosperity, to oversimplify things. But this is how it looks from down under. And Professor, what I took out of this, it was my impression that Professor Mearsheimer said stiffly that it is time to choose, that you can no longer ride the two horses at the same time. So, and this with some decoupling trends points to two separate economic blocks.
I don't know what Mearsheimer had in mind exactly. Is he saying that the Australians shouldn't sell iron ore and coal and wheat to China? They buy mainly raw materials from China, agricultural and mining goods. Australia doesn't sell them sophisticated computer chips. So what does he want the Australians to do? I think Australia is going to continue selling to whomever buys its products. They're not going to shut down, and that will in fact be China. So it sounds to me like an empty statement on Mearsheimer's part. I'm not a fan of his, by the way.
But that is correct. But then again, you look at different, more delicate issues like 5G, and you see this immense pressure coming from the US. And immense pressure coming from China, really, on many other diplomatic fronts.
Well, that's right. We put immense pressure on our allies to boycott China's 5G product. And for the most part, everyone politely listened to us and went ahead and did business with China, because we in America do not produce anything like that. And the alternative from Ericsson and Nokia is more expensive and not quite as good. So our attempts to tell people to choose have led people to choose China for the most part. I don't think we can do that without creating our own alternative. My view is that if we want NATO to be strong, and I'm an Atlanticist, I would like to see a strong NATO. If we took technological leadership and put the resources behind it and asked our European allies and other allies to join us in that effort, we get an enthusiastic level of participation. But if we simply tell them, don't do business with China, but we're not doing anything about it, eventually they will do business with China. So I don't believe this policy, a purely negative policy, has been successful or will be successful in the future.
And final question, another quote of yours that stuck with me is that the US is in a sort of civil Cold War state. I think this is your quote. If I'm wrong, please.
Well,
please
I'm actually quoting the strategist Angelo Codevilla, Cold Civil War. Yes, we have a deep cultural and political division in the United States, such as we've never seen before, between part of the population that feels that it's been left behind, it's resentful and wants more redistribution of wealth, particularly minority, but not only minority populations, represented by the left wing of the Democratic Party, and Trump, who represents an attempt to reverse the cultural tide and a clearly capitalist orientation in economics. We've had divisions before, but we've never had an opposition calling itself the resistance. We've never had the two sides questioning the legitimacy and even the right to speak of the other. This, in my view, is most distressing. I think there's blame on both sides, though I tend to blame the left a great deal more. You don't have mobs of conservative students beating up liberal speakers at universities, and you do have mobs of left-wing students beating up conservative speakers at universities. So I'm not drawing a moral equivalence, but I would join those who say that a return to a more civil and rational discourse would be good for all of us.
David, I personally would love to continue this conversation really for about an hour, but I know you are running out of time. It's 12 p.m. now in New York, 12 midday in New York, 6 p.m. in Warsaw. So unless you have more time, I'm not going to keep you much longer. But
well, we can certainly continue the conversation another time. Thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion.
Thank you, David. I genuinely hope we can. So have a great day.
Okay, thank you very much. Goodbye now.